Okay, so now we can deal with the endpoint of the 69 weeks, and that's the terminus ad quem. And so before I get to all the detail and working out that, we've established the beginning of that of the 69 weeks was 444 BC, Artaxerxes decreed in Nehemiah. Before I go into all the calculation of the terminus ad quem, the endpoint, let me go over the concept here of the cutting off of the Messiah. Because we got to get our interpretation of Scripture, make sure it makes sense before we create a whole doctrine on this. So the term cut off, what does that word mean? Well, when applied to a person or individual, a human being, it's meaning to cut down or kill, to kill that person. And the best way to look at words in the Bible is to compare their use to other uses of that same word in the Bible elsewhere. So in Leviticus 7, 20 through 21, there it's using the word cut off, the same Hebrew word, with respect to execution by means of the death penalty. Death, okay? In Proverbs 2:22 and Psalm 37:9, which I'm going to focus on here in a minute, but just to kind of overview that, it's talking about eradicating someone, an individual, not just in death, but death, making them eradicated from the face of the planet Earth, to get them off the land. Just think about how Jews think of their land. You get off my land. I don't want your presence on my land if it's my land. And that's how they thought about an evildoer or wicked person. That's the idea of the scapegoat. Get that sin off the physical earth, get it out of my camp. And the scapegoat took it off. And so this getting a sinful person that's wicked off your land is important. So I'm going to focus on that when we interpret this word cut off. It also used in the setting of destroying or killing in Genesis 9:11 and Deuteronomy 20:20. That establishes the use of the word cut off as involving the execution or death of someone, but also the removal of that person from the face of the earth. It's used that way. That's how it's used hermeneutically. Now, going back to Sir Robert Anderson's method here, I wanted to set up that word cut off because I'm going to get to that in a minute. But as we make this calculation, we have to kind of show where the ones that have come before what I'm showing have errors. So that's what I'm going to do right now. First of all, let me show a point where I agree with what they've done. It's already what I've already been discussing, that we're dealing with sevens of not days, but sevens of years. And so if you're dealing with, and we're dealing with 360 days per year, not 365 or 365.25 or however you want to put it. It's 360 days prophetic years. And if you do that and you convert those years to days, and that's the best way to do it. I agree with Anderson's approach and Harold Honer, that the best way to do it is to convert it to days, because days never change. There's always 24 hours in a day. And we don't have to worry about leap years. I don't care whose calendar you're using, we're all dealing with days. So when you convert that out, the 360 days per year over a period of 69 sevens of years, that calculates out to 173,880 days. And I agree with that. So then Sir Robert Anderson starts it from Nisan 1, which is arbitrary, because the prophecy I was careful to point out doesn't tell you what day in Nisan that when Nehemiah was asking Artaxerxes to let him go back. It doesn't tell you what day in the month of Nisan he was allowed to go back in 444 BC. But Sir Robert Anderson took Nisan 1 and he said 445 BC. And there's an error too. So you can start to say, well, there's an error there. We've already demonstrated that. He then said it must end at the terminus ad quem must be the triumphal entry when Christ rides into Jerusalem on the donkey. And he specified that date as Sunday, the 6th of April in 32 AD, which he said was Nisan 10. And a couple problems with that. Number one, the triumphal entry is not the crucifixion. It's before it. So there's no cutting off on that day. He's still alive. So if you're going to adopt the crucifixion and insist that that be the cutoff, you don't have any system out there right now that says the crucifixion is the cutoff. You have the triumphal entry as the cutoff right now. And so I think that's a problem just to say that, because it doesn't fully take into account the word cutoff means. So another problem is he's ending it in 32 AD because he starts it at 445 BC. And 32 AD, the Passover, Nisan 14, was on a Monday. And that's just can't be, that's impossible because you have to have Christ crucified and taken down before a Sabbath. And so the Sabbath is not a Tuesday, it's a Saturday. So you can't have, 32 AD won't work as a year for his crucifixion or his triumphal entry. So you have to take that off the table. Now, for the purposes of review, because Harold Hoehner is going to use some of Robert Anderson's method, even though Harold Hoehner corrects it to 444 BC as the start point. What Sir Robert Anderson then proceeded to do was correctly recognize that we use solar years. So he said, well, the difference between 445 BC and 32 AD is 476 solar years. And that's the same problem if you take 444 BC up to 33 AD. It's still 476 solar years. So we're going to go through some tricks to get it into the system he's created. So he says, okay, 476 solar years with 365.25 days per year, dealing with a Julian system, which is already going to have problems because he's not doing the Gregorian calculation. It's more accurate. He's doing a Julian calculation. But he's not staying in the Julian system, so he's introducing error. He's not consistent. He's going in and out of systems without correcting for them. And so he says 476 years by 365 days, 365.25 days per year. He arrives at 173,740 days. And so I told you he's got to make it match to 173,880 days. And so he has to say, okay, there's 116 leap years, 116 days to count for by leap years. So he adds 116 days. He makes that calculation. And then he says, okay, he called 445 BC. He said it was March 14th in 445 BC that the decree was given. So I'll say March 14th is one day, and then April 6th of AD 32. What's the difference between those 2 days? It's 24 days. Add that to 116 and add that to 173,740, and voila, you get 173,880. But there's error introduced in there because he's gone back and forth, back and forth. So without going into further detail, that's what's done there. And the only difference between him and Harold Hoehner is Harold Hoehner stuck with the triumphal entry. All Harold Hoehner did was correct for the start point. He correctly recognized that it was 444 BC, but otherwise he made it line up to triumphal entry, and he used Anderson's method, and he kept Nisan 1, which is arbitrary, and he tried to make it fit into the crucifixion, really the triumphal entry in 33 AD. But the problem with Harold Hoehner's point of view is that he in so doing and making his calculation, he says that Nisan 1, he insists that it's got to be Nisan 1 in 444 BC as the start point, and he says that was March 5th. I showed on one of my figures that that was April 2nd, and you can determine that from going to a calendar converter software. You can also use old research studies, which I've done also in my paper, but the easiest way to do it is to just go to a free calendar converter online. And I've used the one at Harvard Mathematics Department. And I picked Harvard because it's Harvard, and you probably will respect that. And so go to I have their link, and you can go to their mathematics department website, and they've linked to a calendar converter software that they think is legit. But they're all the same, ultimately. You can go to NASA website and use a converter software there as well. But on the Harvard Mathematics website, it converts between Julian system, Gregorian, and all these calendar systems throughout the world, including the Hebrew calendar, also the Islamic calendar, whichever one you're interested in, you can go back and forth just doing that, using that website. But when you use that website and you plug in Nisan 1 of 444 BC, it tells you it's April 2nd. And that's off a whole 3 weeks. And it's the wrong direction. So it's off forward. So it pushes his calculation 3 weeks after the crucifixion, after the triumphal entry, after the crucifixion. And it's inaccurate. His calculation doesn't work. And many have criticized him for it, and many have rejected the dispensational point of view. And I would say that you have to reject his calculation and come up with something new, something better. And that's what I did in this paper. I offered something better, I believe, that is also hermeneutically sound, which I will show in a minute. Now, Friday, April 3rd of 33 AD as a crucifixion date is a good date for the crucifixion. So I'm going to use that date as the crucifixion date. I'm not going to use that as my endpoint, but that's part of my endpoint, and I'll show that in a minute. But why Friday, April 3rd of 33 AD? If you refer to Jack Finnegan's Handbook of Biblical Chronology, he goes into some explanation as to why that's a good year. Also, I'd just point out something very interesting was that there was a partial lunar eclipse on that date, which has been shown in two papers, one in 1983 in Nature, that journal, and also in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society in 1990. Both of those show, and if you plug it into any kind of star software, it'll also show you like Starry Night or one of those softwares. You'll see that there was on April 3rd on the Julian calendar. I got to emphasize that. I'm not using the Gregorian calendar, I'm using the Julian calendar. I believe on the Gregorian, Friday of AD 33 in April was April 5th. That would be Passover. But don't use the Gregorian, you'll be confused. Stick with the Julian. That's why I've been emphasizing that. And these papers, these scientific papers, used the Julian. That confuses people, and it's rendered a lot of comments on these issues muddy. So clarify that. But they showed that there was a partial lunar eclipse on that date, and you can see it if you plug it into a Starry Night type software. But it was a partial eclipse, and as they were taking Jesus' body off the cross, later on that evening, within an hour or so, the moon's up there, and you can see it going into a blood moon, but partially. So blood moon is always carrying a kind of negative connotation, and Christ had to die for our sins. He took our sins upon himself, and that's a sad, tragic thing that he had to do that, but it's only partial eclipse because there's also hope. That's how we are saved. That's the mechanism of accomplishing atonement for iniquity, which is what this whole prophecy is about in Daniel 9:24 and 25. It's talking about the purpose of the 70 weeks is to seal up vision and prophecy, make an end of sin, make atonement for iniquity. And that's why it's a partial eclipse. Another good reason to take Friday, April 3rd of 33 AD as the crucifixion of Christ. And so if that's the case, I'm going to show you a better way, I believe, to make this calculation. Now, I mentioned previously that the word cutoff can include eradication, and should include the eradication of someone from the planet Earth. And that means removing them physically from it. Any normal man, when he's dead, he's removed from the face of the planet Earth. But Christ was not a normal man. He resurrected, and he kind of threw a monkey wrench into the use of the word cutoff. So cutoff has to include both his crucifixion, resurrection, and his ascension. That's when he's fully removed from the planet Earth. That's when the scapegoat takes the sin away out of our presence. So his ascension is necessary. It's essential to part of his working out of our salvation, I believe. That's why he had to ascend and leave for a time. He took our sin away. It's just kind of figurative, and it meets that Old Testament, prophetic type. But it's important. And so part of his cutting off was his cutting off was predicated and initiated by his crucifixion and was completed by his ascension. So if you use the ascension, you can solve this problem easily. So first I'll show my method using the true Nissan 1, which I think is, you don't have to use Nissan 1, but sticking with Honer's methodology, Harold Honer, I keep referencing, sticking with his methodology and showing you that when you apply my method to it, it renders a problem. So if Nissan 1 wasn't March 5th, as he said, but if it was April 2nd of 444 BC, we'll use the Julian days. A Julian date has a Julian day number assigned to it by astronomers. They've come up with a system to do this. So you're just using that system. You can go to the NASA Eclipse website and do it. You can also do it on that Harvard calendar converter website. You can get the Julian day number. It'll spit it out. And it'll spit it out as a 0.5 number. I've rounded up to the nearest whole number. It still works out either way, just to make it simple and easy to look at. So the 2nd of April, 444 BC, which was the true Nissan 1 of 444 BC, was Julian day number 1559344, rounded up. When you add 173,880 days to that, that's the days of the 69 weeks, That gets you to the Julian day number 1733224. That equates to the 23rd of April of 33 AD. Now, I just showed you April 3rd of 33 AD was the Friday of his crucifixion. That was Nisan 14. So you're removed from it by 20 days ahead of it, past it. And you can't go any farther back in Nisan. You're on Nisan 1 of 444 BC. Any other day is going to push it farther away from Christ's crucifixion, but before his ascension, kind of in the middle gray zone. So I think it's better to regard his ascension as the endpoint of this prophecy. And so now I will first demonstrate that. Let me show you in words. Psalm 37:9. Just looking at the wording there. Evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord, they will inherit the land. Cut off from the land or inheriting the land. Christ took on our sin, and he wasn't an evildoer, but he took the punishment of an evildoer. So he has to be fully cut off as well. Proverbs 2:22, I think, states it even more plainly. The same word, cut off, same Hebrew word. The wicked will be cut off from the land. And Christ was cut off in the name of wickedness. He took on our wickedness and was cut off, both physically in death and physically bodily at his ascension. That's why I think you have to perceive as a cut off involving the ascension, and that's hermeneutically sound. So if that's the case, we know that he was on the earth for 40 days after his resurrection. We're told that in Acts 1:3. So his resurrection is going to be Sunday, the 5th of April, which is the 16th of Nisan, 33 AD. So if Sunday, the 5th of April, 33 AD is day one of that count, it's not 0, it's day 1. Day 2 is the next day. Day 40 is going to end up being Thursday, May 14th, 33 AD. I just got the Julian day numbers for those dates and did the same, added 40 to it. But you have to include his resurrection day as day 1, and that gets you to Thursday, the 14th of May of 33 AD. That's his ascension day. That's the terminus ad quem of this prophecy. That's when he was ascended. So what day number is that? That's Julian day number 1733245, the day number assigned to that date. So just subtract 173,880 days from it, and that should get you to the time of the beginning of this prophecy. You just go backwards, you work backwards, and you back into it. So you don't choose Nisan 1 just arbitrarily, and you don't try to contrive it to make it all fit to the triumphal entry. But you hermeneutically determine when the cutoff should be, and we did that. That's why I showed the passages and made the connections with the word, and that the cutoff should be his ascension. Hermeneutically, theologically, in every way, it should be the ascension. Figure that Julian day number out, keep it within the Julian system, convert the calendar to days and keep it within days. Days never change. They're always 24 hours in a day, and you're going to keep it correct. I don't see a problem there. So Julian day number 1733245, that's the terminus ad quem. That's Thursday, 14th of May, AD 33. Subtract 173,880 days. You get Thursday, the 23rd of April of 444 BC. Another Thursday, interestingly, and that's just by chance. But Thursday of 23 April, 444 BC. I told you that April 2nd of 444 BC was Nisan 1. So Nisan 22 is the 23rd of April of 444 BC. That's in the month of Nisan. That qualifies. That still fits the prophecy, if we interpret the decree given to Nehemiah as the appropriate decree for this prophecy, to begin this prophecy. So it looks like the decree was given to Nehemiah on Nisan 22 of 444 BC, and it works out perfectly. Add the 173,880 days to that date, and it gets you to the Ascension, Thursday, the 14th of May, 33 AD. And we can know these dates exactly, which is incredibly amazing. It's also incredibly amazing that this was prophesied before it ever took place. And if there's any question in your mind about it, even our earliest copies of the book of Daniel, our physical text papyrus copies of the book of Daniel, are from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that dates to 200 years or so prior to Christ. So even in that text, this is present. And it shows you, it predicts when the Messiah must come and when he must be cut off. And it's exact to the day. So I present this, number one, to hopefully solve a problem that is present in the works of both Sir Robert Anderson and Dr. Harold Hoehner. and I do so respectfully. Harold Hoehner modified an error of Sir Robert Anderson, and I'm modifying, and you could call it an error, of Harold Hoehner. And someone's welcome to come along and modify an error that I may have made. There's no human pride here. This is just trying to get this understood accurately and in a theologically sound manner. So I don't think we're not adding anything new theologically. We're not making a new doctrine. We are just better defining something with better technology, better understanding of history, science, calendars, etc., using tools that we didn't have 100 years, 150 years ago, that we do have now, that has helped us interpret this. So I'd pray that this would help bolster your faith, and if you're not a believer, that you would see that this was prophesied to take place, that Christ was prophesied to be cut off, to be crucified, and to raise from the dead, and to ascend. It's all built into the prophecy. And it was given before it ever happened, on the order of hundreds of years before it ever happened. And if you're doubting that there is a God, or you're doubting that Jesus is God in the flesh and did all this, this helps your faith. Does it prove it? There's debate on this. I admit that. There's people who adopt different point of views. So I can't say honestly that this is smoking gun proof. But if you just look at it logically and you don't try to introduce other ideas for the sake of derailing it, just for that sake, the most simple way to look at it, the way that Occam's razor, if you are familiar with that saying, that would dictate the simplest, most easy, most straightforward answer is usually the right one. So that's what I use when I practice medicine. That's what I use when I study the Bible. And that's what I use when I live my daily life. And usually you're going to get it right. That's just a good principle. In this case, the most straightforward path here is what I've demonstrated. And because of that, it should help prove to you that Christ did come in the flesh. He did die on the cross for your sins. He was cut off, just as Daniel specifies, for the atonement of sin, atonement of iniquity, to make an end of sin. And that's what this comes down to. It's not about the scientific endeavor here. It's not about the knowledge I'm giving you. It's about changing your perception of Christ and allowing you to ask him to come into your life. And the Bible clearly states, if you confess with your mouth, that if you believe in your heart that Jesus rose from the dead, and you confess with your mouth that God sent him, that you will be saved. And so I just ask that you do that you make that act of will choice today. Allow him to come in your heart. And this is just one, maybe you're waiting on that last piece of evidence to show you. I think this is pretty good evidence. Thank you for listening today.